After the car accident, I was rushed to the hospital. In my fading consciousness, I heard my husband telling the doctor to give up on my treatment and to donate my heart to Melissa. Melissa was the one who had hit me with her car. Before being pushed into the operating room, I saw my husband's icy, emotionless gaze. When I opened my eyes again, I was back to the day he proposed to me. This time, I refused him. 5 years later, I returned to the country for a class reunion. At the gathering, James locked his eyes on the ring on my finger. His voice trembled as he asked, "Are you married?" Everyone turned to look at my ring in curiosity. After graduating from college, I had gone abroad and hadn't returned for 5 years. No one knew I was already married. A classmate hesitated before asking, "Rachel, is it true? You're really married?" I glanced briefly at James before turning to answer. "Yes, I'm married." The entire room fell into silence. Instinctively, everyone looked toward James. His face was unnervingly dark, his expression cold and unreadable. Everyone knew that on the day of our graduation photos, James had proposed to me, and I had rejected him. For the past 5 years, he had remained single, never getting involved with anyone. People always said he was waiting for me. Back then, my sudden rejection had shocked everyone. After all, James and I had been deeply in love. No one understood why I had changed overnight. Only I knew. Because I had already died once. Under my classmates' stunned gazes, James suddenly stood up and strode toward me. Before I could react, he grabbed my wrist and dragged me out of the private room. His grip was strong, and I couldn't break free. No one else tried to stop him. Once we reached a secluded corner, he turned abruptly, his bloodshot eyes locking onto mine. "Tell me, what exactly happened back then? Why did you do that?" His voice trembled, every word carrying suppressed rage and pain. I frowned and instinctively stepped back. Based on my past life's memories, by now he should have already met Melissa. Without my interference, they should have been together long ago. Testing the waters, I asked, "Where's Melissa?" He frowned in confusion. "Who?" I suddenly understood. They hadn't met yet. In my past life, James and I had been arguing in a cafe when Melissa appeared. She had stepped in front of me, stubborn and indignant, and said, "Sir, you shouldn't treat a lady like this." I still remembered. James had frozen for a long moment. Later, I realized that was the moment Melissa had planted herself in his heart. Could it be that because I didn't go to the cafe to argue with him this time, he never got the chance to meet her? James suddenly kicked the trash can behind him, his jaw clenched as the veins on his forehead pulsed. "Rachel, are you really married?" I nodded. "Yes, I am. I met my husband in my 2nd year abroad. Before him, I thought I would never love anyone again, but he healed me, brought me back to life." Thinking about him filled my heart with warmth and peace. I looked straight into James's eyes and repeated firmly, "I'm truly married." His expression darkened even more. "Do you love him?" "Of course," I answered without hesitation, but in the next moment, his anger exploded. He punched the wall hard, his face twisting in agony. "Tell me it's not true," he demanded. I took a few steps back, but he advanced, his presence suffocating. "No, it's impossible. How could you suddenly fall in love with someone else?" His voice cracked. "I've been waiting for you for 5 years. How could you love someone else?" Just as he was about to grab me, I raised my hand and slapped him across the face with all my strength. I had thought that I had let go of all the resentment from my past life. But now I realized those feelings hadn't disappeared. I had only buried them deep inside. I still hated James. Perhaps the hatred in my eyes was too overwhelming, too piercing. He instinctively took a few steps back. James muttered under his breath, his voice hoarse. "You hate me?" I met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, I hate you." His expression stiffened. "Why? What exactly happened?" He couldn't bring himself to look directly into my eyes. I didn't know why, but when our eyes met, when he saw the resentment burning within me, something inside him twisted in pain. His head dropped slightly, as if suddenly exhausted. "Tell me." His voice was low, almost pleading. "Did I do something wrong?" I turned away, refusing to meet his gaze. Those eyes that had once captivated me in my past life, now only made me feel sick. "Leave," I said coldly. "From now on, you take your path, and I'll take mine." Back in the private room, the atmosphere fell silent again, as all eyes turned to me. Someone whispered, "Rachel is really married. How come there wasn't any news about it?" No idea, she was abroad for 5 years. Who knows if she actually got married? They were so in love back then. Why did they suddenly break up? That was around the time James's family had issues, wasn't it? Everyone thought they were going bankrupt. He wouldn't have left her because of that, right? My sharp gaze landed on the person stirring up speculation, a male classmate who had once pursued me, only to be rejected. Caught red-handed, he awkwardly shut his mouth. I stood up and spoke calmly. James and I separated because we weren't right for each other. There was no other reason. Let's just enjoy the reunion. It took a lot for us all to gather again. Don't waste it. James, who had followed me back, had clearly overheard my words. His gaze lingered on me, silent and unreadable. For the rest of the night, he didn't speak. He just sat in the corner, drinking alone, brooding. When the gathering ended, I said goodbye to my classmates and went to the bus stop to wait for my ride. Unexpectedly, a black Mercedes pulled up in front of me. I planned to ignore it, but then the window rolled down, revealing James behind the wheel. His expression was tense, and his eyes burned with restrained anger. "Get in." His voice was clipped, almost commanding. I kept my tone neutral. "I'll take the bus." His face darkened at my rejection. He turned to look at me, but his gaze involuntarily landed on my wedding ring. "Your husband is so useless that you still have to squeeze onto a crowded bus?" he scoffed. I rolled my eyes and took a step farther from his car. Without hesitation, he got out and followed me. I felt an overwhelming sense of irritation. Since when had James become so persistent? He used to care about his pride, but now he was acting shamelessly. I stopped and turned to glare at him. "What the hell do you want?" I snapped. His eyes bore into mine, filled with frustration and resentment. "I just don't understand," he said, his voice laced with disbelief. "How did you become like this?" I frowned. "Like what?" Instead of answering, he clenched his jaw and shoved his phone in front of me. I looked at the screen and saw the content clearly. It was a photo of me walking side by side with a man in his 50s or 60s. Instinctively, I opened my mouth to explain, but James cut me off before I could say a word. "How could you sink so low?" His voice was filled with disdain. At that moment, the expression on his face overlapped with the countless times in my past life when we had argued until our faces turned red. His eyes were full of judgment, distrust, and contempt, as if he was standing on higher ground, looking down on me. For a second, it felt like I had been dragged back into that nightmare. My body turned ice cold, as if my limbs had been submerged in freezing water. Every breath I took was agony. "Get out." I lost control and shouted. I slapped his phone out of his hand, sending it crashing to the ground. The screen shattered into pieces. To James, my reaction was proof that I had been exposed and was now furious out of humiliation. There was a hint of twisted satisfaction in his eyes. "I won't say anything," he said smugly. "I'll keep your secret. I can even help you escape from this mess. As long as you're willing to come back to me." I stared at him coldly, making no effort to hide the hatred in my eyes. "Listen carefully, James. I would rather die than go back to you." Unfortunately, that moment was caught by some unscrupulous reporters. The next day, James and I became a trending topic online. The headline read, "Heir of the James family bows his head for love, only to be coldly rejected by his first love." I stared at those bold letters, speechless. Just then, my phone rang. It was my husband, Ethan. "Babe, do you need me to handle this?" His deep, steady voice brought warmth to my heart. I reassured him gently, "It's nothing, just a small issue." "Then come home soon. Our daughter misses you." As soon as he finished speaking, I heard my little girl's soft, sweet voice in the background. "Mommy, I miss you." My heart melted instantly. "Baby, Mommy misses you too. I'll come home soon, okay?" James had said he would keep my secret, but not long after, that photo spread everywhere. People who never liked me took the opportunity to mock me in our class group chat. I knew it. How could Rachel afford such a big diamond ring? Turns out she's been kept by an old man. This is so embarrassing. I can't believe I went to school with someone like her. She probably rejected James 5 years ago because she had already found a sugar daddy. Think about it. James's family had financial trouble back then. And right at that time, Rachel suddenly disappeared abroad. Guess we all know what really happened. Some of my close friends in the group tried to defend me, but their voices were drowned out by the nasty speculations. Throughout all this, James remained silent. A thought crept into my mind. Could it be that he was the one who leaked the photo? It wouldn't surprise me. He had always been shameless. But right now, I didn't have time to dwell on it. I quickly sent a message in the chat to clear things up. For the record, the man standing next to me in that photo is my father-in-law. But instead of stopping, the chat exploded with even worse comments. Oh wow, so open-minded, huh? Father-in-law? Sure. Sounds more like a disgusting affair. Are you sleeping with both father and son? That's some next-level stuff. I've heard foreign women are wild, but Rachel really takes it to another level. Reading those venomous words, my hands trembled with rage. My vision blurred with fury, and my eyes burned as if they could bleed. I was just about to unleash my anger in the group chat, but suddenly, the group was disbanded. Just great. Now I was even angrier, with nowhere to vent my frustration. At that moment, I got a message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years, our old class president, Kevin. Sorry, Rachel. They really went too far. Kevin had always been a decent person, humble, hardworking, and genuinely kind to his classmates. I wasn't going to take my anger out on him, so I simply replied, "It's fine, I'll just make a public statement online later." But then Kevin sent another message. "Rachel, listen. I have proof. It was James who leaked the photo." My brows furrowed as I read his words. James is ruthless. He's doing this on purpose to destroy you. Whatever you do, don't forgive him. I clenched my jaw and replied, "Don't worry. I never will." I knew exactly what James was trying to do. He wanted me to regret. He wanted me to beg him. But there was no way I would ever give him that satisfaction. Meanwhile, Ethan had already heard about everything happening back home. Without hesitation, he dropped everything at work and booked the next flight back. I had tried to tell him it wasn't necessary, but his response was firm. "No, I'm coming back. You are my wife. I can't just stand by and watch you be humiliated." I could no longer bring myself to refuse him. A week later, news spread throughout the business world. Ethan Foster, the powerful CEO, had returned home with his wife and daughter. The industry reacted instantly. The Foster family was a true legacy, a dynasty that had thrived for centuries. They were the definition of old money. Compared to them, the James family was insignificant. Meanwhile, Kevin re-established a new class group chat. He even made an announcement. Anyone who dares to insult a classmate will be kicked out immediately. At first, no one paid much attention to his warning, but then, James finally spoke up. "Keep running your mouth and be careful with your jobs." The group instantly fell silent. I wasn't moved by this. If anything, I was just surprised. The day Ethan returned to the country, the Foster family hosted a grand reception. Naturally, I had to attend. At the entrance, security stopped me. "Apologies, ma'am. Without an invitation, you can't enter." I was about to show my credentials when a voice stopped me in my tracks. A voice that sent a shiver down my spine. It was Melissa. "Sir, don't make things difficult for her," she said gently. "They're just doing their jobs." My entire body froze. I couldn't move. Melissa's voice had haunted my nightmares countless times, dragging me into darkness. I had thought that as long as I stayed away from James in this life, I would never have to see her again. Yet here she was. Her voice was sweet, soft yet firm. "You should just leave. Without an invitation, you won't be able to get in." At that moment, I finally snapped out of my daze. I turned to face her. She stood there in a pale blue dress, looking ethereal, like a beam of pure moonlight. I couldn't control the hatred that surged inside me. "Melissa, you should never have appeared in front of me." I never planned to get involved with her again. I just wanted to live my life. "So why do they keep showing up, one after another?" Melissa tilted her head, puzzled. She didn't understand why a complete stranger would harbor such hostility toward her. But then, as if something clicked, she gave a knowing smile. It made sense to her. After all, she had been envied and resented by women all her life. Being misunderstood by other women was her fate. She accepted it. After all, she was beautiful, elegant, and the unattainable dream of countless men. To her, I must have looked like a jealous wife, bitter and scorned. Many women had taken her as a rival before. She was used to it. With that thought, a flicker of pity crossed Melissa's eyes as she looked at me. She didn't even seem to notice that I already knew her name. "Sis," she said softly, "my invitation allows me to bring a guest. How about I take you in with me?" Her gentle offer only made me look even more pathetic in the eyes of the security guards. I had no idea how she even got an invitation. This was the Foster family's reception. Only the most elite of the elite were invited. Melissa was just a university student from an average family. How could she possibly have access to an event like this? As confusion filled my mind, the answer arrived in the form of a man. James's car pulled up at that very moment. The moment he stepped out, people around him hurried to greet him, eager to get close. Despite his young age, he was already the heir of the James family. Naturally, many wanted to curry favor with him. The moment he got out of the car, his eyes landed on me. Then they shifted to Melissa. "Stay close to me. Don't wander off." Melissa obediently nodded. I rolled my eyes at them. So in this life, these two still ended up meeting. It seemed that without me in the way, they got together even faster. In my past life, around this time, they had only just met, or at least, I hadn't known they had already been in contact behind my back. I only found out on the day I lost my child. That day, Melissa had come to me crying, begging me to let James go. She had said that James loved her. She had also said that if I truly loved him, I should learn to let go. Since James no longer loved me, I should set him free. I didn't want to deal with them anymore, so I took out my phone and called Ethan, hoping he could come pick me up. Before the call even connected, Melissa spoke again. "Mr. James? This lady also wants to go in. Let's take her with us." James didn't say a word. He just stood there, staring at me. I knew exactly what he was waiting for. He wanted me to beg him. I shot him another glare and scoffed. "Psycho." His face darkened. He let out a cold snort before pulling Melissa inside with him. As they walked, he deliberately turned back and sneered. "If you don't want me to take you in, are you planning to wait for your sugar daddy?" At that moment, my call finally went through. The moment I heard his voice, I could no longer hold back the grievances I had been suppressing. "Ethan, come pick me up." His voice was instantly filled with concern. "Babe, who's bullying you?" Ethan had always been attentive and considerate. He immediately noticed the heaviness in my tone. James hadn't left after going inside. He stood nearby, watching the scene unfold like it was some kind of show. When he heard me call Ethan husband, his face twisted, turning rigid and dark. He scoffed, voice full of mockery. "Oh, so you're still expecting that loser husband of yours, the one who makes you squeeze onto crowded buses? You'd be better off begging me instead." Melissa gasped and covered her mouth in surprise. She turned to James, eyes wide. "Mr. James, she's your first love?" He didn't even hesitate. "She doesn't count as a first love. Just a mistake I made when I was young." With that one sentence, he reduced everything we had shared to nothing more than a joke. Luckily, I no longer loved him. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to handle the pain of hearing those words. Not that it was the worst thing he had ever said to me. In my past life, I had heard far crueler words from his lips. I never understood why, even after moving on, he had to be so heartless towards someone he once loved. After making that cutting remark, James walked away. Melissa followed close behind him. 5 minutes later, Ethan arrived. The moment he saw me, his face filled with guilt. "Babe, I'm so sorry you had to go through this. Don't worry, I won't let him off so easily." Just then, my daughter ran up and wrapped her little arms around my leg. "Mommy, I missed you so much." I wasn't upset anymore. The moment I saw them, all my grievances disappeared. It was as if the storm had passed and the skies had cleared. The security guards who had witnessed the entire scene were now drenched in cold sweat. They had long heard rumors that Vice President Foster was utterly devoted to his wife. If they had truly offended me, they might be out of a job by tomorrow. One of the guards was probably crying internally, regretting that he had just lost his high-paying, stable job. At the same time, he couldn't help but blame Melissa. If it weren't for her meddling, he wouldn't have stopped me at the door in the first place. Struggling to explain himself, the security guard stammered, I didn't mean." Ethan turned to him, his expression icy, clearly on the verge of losing his temper. Before he could say anything, I reached out and stopped him. "Don't be mad," I said calmly. "He was just doing his job. It's not his fault. I left in a hurry and forgot my invitation." The security guard secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Sure enough, Ethan's expression softened considerably. When we reached the entrance of the grand hall, The butler approached. "Young master, the family patriarch has asked to see you in the back garden." Ethan instinctively glanced at me. I nodded at him, signaling for him to go. Our daughter clung tightly to my leg. "I want to stay with Mommy." Ethan chuckled and shook his head, then gave us a few quick instructions before heading toward the garden. Holding my daughter's hand, I walked into the hall. The atmosphere inside was lively, filled with powerful business moguls from both domestic and international circles. James, as always, was the center of attention, surrounded by a group of businessmen engaged in conversation. I wasn't fond of socializing, so I led my daughter to a quiet corner and sat down. A table in front of us was stacked with an assortment of delicate pastries. Her eyes lit up at the sight of them, but she still turned to me obediently. "Mommy, can I have one?" I nodded. "Yes, but not too many." Excited, she jumped into my arms before eagerly digging into a small cake like a little squirrel. As I watched her happily nibbling, Melissa appeared. She was still smiling, the same ever so gentle, ever so kind expression on her face. "Sis, how did you sneak in?" The moment she spoke, countless eyes turned toward us. Whispers began to spread. "Who is she? Wait, did she actually sneak in? That's impossible. The security at foster family events is always impeccable. No way someone uninvited could get in." Melissa continued to smile, but the more I looked at her, the more I found her insincere. In my past life, I could understand why she saw me as a threat. It was because of James. But this time around, I had barely interacted with him, so why was she still acting this way? Maybe, just maybe, we were destined to be natural enemies. At that moment, James walked over, his eyes filled with surprise as he looked at me. "You? How did you get in?" His words immediately fueled the crowd's doubts. James was currently one of the most influential young figures in the industry. His credibility carried weight, so when he questioned my presence, people naturally started believing him. A few individuals even turned to security, asking them to throw me out. But these were highly trained professionals. They weren't the type to act on baseless accusations. If they were going to remove someone, they needed solid proof first. Just as I was about to explain myself, my daughter's soft voice rang through the hall. "We came in with Daddy." Her voice was crisp and clear, like a delicate silver bell, instantly drawing everyone's attention. James stared at her, frozen in place for several seconds. His gaze lingered on her face, which bore a striking resemblance to mine. His eyes turned red in an instant. Before anyone could react, my daughter continued speaking. "My daddy is amazing. He's Ethan Foster." The entire hall fell into stunned silence. All the murmurs and whispers ceased instantly as everyone exchanged glances, processing what they had just heard. Many people in the business world knew that the Foster family heir had long been married with a child. However, Ethan had always protected his wife and daughter so well that no one had ever seen them publicly. Because of this, no one had been sure whether the rumors were true. Now, the truth was right in front of them. Melissa's ever-so-perfect smile froze. Of course, she knew who Ethan Foster was. If James was someone she desperately wanted to win over, then Ethan was the kind of man she couldn't even dream of reaching. She bit her lip in frustration, casting me a glance filled with unwillingness. She had always believed that her beauty was unmatched, that even actresses in the entertainment industry paled in comparison to her. And yet, I, someone she considered merely average, had managed to marry Ethan Foster? She refused to believe it. Taking a deep breath, she composed herself. She couldn't afford to lose to me. Even she didn't fully understand why she harbored such hostility toward a woman she had just met. Perhaps it was because I had once been James's first love. Meanwhile, James's expression had grown increasingly complicated. His gaze shifted back and forth between me and my daughter, filled with uncertainty and doubt. If I was really Ethan Foster's wife, then he had no chance at all. A voice from the crowd finally broke the silence. "Is your dad really Ethan Foster?" Someone cautiously asked my daughter. She straightened her little back, still holding her tiny cake, and nodded firmly. "Of course. He's my daddy." I gently patted her head and couldn't help but laugh at her confident little stance. Then, I lifted my gaze to the crowd and confirmed, "Yes, I am Ethan Foster's wife." To put any doubts to rest, I reached into my purse, took out my phone, and pulled up a photo. It was a picture of Ethan and me on our wedding day. In the image, I was wearing a white wedding gown, nestled in his arms, my smile radiant. The moment they saw the photo, the entire room went silent. Those who had spoken ill of me earlier quietly backed away, distancing themselves as much as possible. Meanwhile, the rest of the crowd immediately changed their attitudes. The atmosphere took a dramatic shift. "Oh, so this is Mrs. Foster, what an honor. Our apologies, we didn't recognize you earlier. Mr. Foster's daughter looks just like him, so adorable. Mr. and Mrs. Foster are truly a perfect match." I wasn't the type to hold grudges over trivial matters. Since they had given me a way to gracefully resolve the situation, I accepted it. I had no intention of causing a bigger scene. Melissa, however, had been silent ever since seeing the photo. For a long time, she didn't react at all. By the time she snapped out of it, I was already surrounded by people eager to flatter me. Then, a thought crept into her mind. What if the photo was fake? Because in her eyes, there was no way someone like Ethan Foster would choose someone like me. And so she blurted out loud, "That photo must be fake. Why would Mr. Foster marry you?" A gasp rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew Ethan Foster's status in the business world. He was not someone anyone could just impersonate. No one believed that anyone would dare pretend to be his wife. Even James frowned at Melissa, clearly displeased. He had once thought Melissa was interesting, smart, ambitious, and driven. That was why he had agreed to bring her to see the world. But now, how could she say something so brainless? Did she really think she was the only rational person in the room? I turned to Melissa, my gaze cold and sharp. "Melissa, watch your words." At that moment, she finally realized something. I had called her by her name. She stiffened, then instinctively asked, "How do you know me? Did you investigate me?" Her words only made the people around her look at her like she was an idiot. Even James's breathing grew uneven. For the first time, he regretted his decision. Why had he agreed to bring her here? Finally, unable to hold back anymore, James spoke. His voice laced with frustration. "If you don't know what to say, then just shut up." The moment those words left his mouth, Melissa's eyes turned red with unshed tears. For the first time, she felt truly humiliated. A strange memory flashed through Melissa's mind. She saw James holding her gently, whispering words of love. Recently, these unfamiliar fragments had been surfacing in her thoughts more and more. But the strangest thing was, back then, she hadn't even known James. Yet, by following these scattered and fragmented memories, she had found him. She had deliberately staged an accidental meeting, which led to their acquaintance. Melissa had always believed it was fate, a sign from the heavens that James was meant to be hers. Thinking about this, she suddenly felt wronged. "James, how can you be so mean to me?" Her voice was soft, pitiful. "You promised you would always be good to me." James looked at her like she was crazy. When had he ever said that? They had barely known each other for a month. He admitted that at first, he had allowed her to get close simply because she was beautiful. But she was nothing more than a temporary distraction. There was no way he would have said something so desperate. James was utterly confused, but I knew exactly what was happening. Melissa must have regained some of her past life memories, but judging by her behavior, she hadn't remembered everything. The seething hatred buried deep in my veins reached its peak. Since she had returned, things would be even easier. In my past life, Melissa had been my true enemy. It was because of her that I lost my child. She had even run me over with her car, leaving me gravely injured. And in the end, she took my heart. The overwhelming hatred within me could no longer be contained. I wanted to do something, anything, but then, a firm hand rested on my shoulder. "Babe, I'm here." It was Ethan. He had just rushed over from the back garden, only to find the tense and hostile atmosphere in the hall. He didn't know exactly what had happened, but he didn't need to. Because no matter what, he would always be on my side. Without hesitation, he picked up our daughter and looked coldly at both Melissa and James. "Get them out." Melissa's face went pale. She finally realized what she had just done. But it was too late. A group of tall, burly security guards had already grabbed her and dragged her out. James was thrown out right after her. Once they were both gone, Ethan turned to the crowd and publicly announced my identity. He warned everyone that from now on, any disrespect toward me or our daughter would not be tolerated. And then, he declared that the Foster family would no longer do business with the James family. The entire room was shaken. Everyone knew this was the beginning of the end for the James family. Without the backing of the Fosters, who else would dare continue working with them? The crowd immediately voiced their support, nodding and promising to comply. With that, the tension in the room finally settled, but the real chaos was only just beginning. Back in the class group chat, things exploded. "Oh my God, she's really Ethan Foster's wife?" I looked into that old man in the photo. Turns out he's Ethan's father. He rarely appears in public, so we didn't recognize him. "Rachel, we were just joking earlier. You don't mind, right?" I didn't bother replying. I simply set the group chat to mute and ignored it. When the banquet ended, I got into the car with my daughter in my arms. She had already fallen asleep. As I looked out at the brightly lit Foster estate, 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. If Melissa had truly regained some of her past life memories, then she wouldn't stop here. A grand show was about to begin. And sure enough, the next time I saw her, she was a completely different person. Gone was the innocent, naive girl from before. Instead, she carried herself with confidence and poise. The meeting happened at a high-profile fashion event. The room was filled with elite socialites and business moguls. The flash of cameras was blinding. In this life, Melissa had actually entered the entertainment industry. In my past life, James had protected her well, keeping her far away from the murky waters of showbiz. Now she was walking toward me, gracefully lifting the hem of her dress with a practiced elegance. She hadn't even graduated from college yet, but the cunning glint in her eyes made her look like a seasoned player in the world of fame and fortune. I knew then she had truly returned. She headed straight for me, drawing the attention of those around us. Many had already heard rumors about the incident at the Foster family banquet. Gossip-mongers eagerly watched, waiting for a spectacle. "Mrs. Foster, long time no see," Melissa greeted me with a smile. I didn't spare her a glance, keeping my eyes on the phone screen, watching a video of my daughter, her expression twisted with anger. She hated being overshadowed by me, the woman she had crushed so thoroughly in our past life. In her eyes, I was meant to be trampled under her feet, forever. After regaining her past life memories, she had spent countless efforts coaxing James into getting her into the entertainment industry. But this time, James was no longer her end goal. She was no longer satisfied with just owning him. She wanted Ethan. Melissa let out a soft chuckle. "At the Foster family banquet, you said I was rude. I must apologize." She curtsied slightly, playing the part of the perfect, well-mannered woman. But the moment no one was looking, she leaned in and whispered into my ear. "Do you really think you've won? In our past life, you lost to me. In this life, you'll lose again. Your husband will be mine." At last, I raised my eyes to meet hers. "Oh," I said, my voice indifferent. "Then I'll be waiting to see how that turns out. If she could really take Ethan from me, then it would only mean he wasn't worth my love to begin with." After everything I had been through, I no longer naively believed in a man's undying devotion. Just then, a warm hand rested on my shoulder. I turned my head. "Ethan? Did he hear what she just said? Did he notice my reaction? Would he blame me for my moment of doubt?" My heart pounded in my chest. Ethan ruffled my hair lightly and smiled. "What are you thinking about?" he asked playfully. "You're not considering leaving me, are you? That's not allowed." Melissa's face visibly stiffened. She nervously tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, suddenly self-conscious, afraid she wasn't pretty enough, afraid she wasn't alluring enough. Just as she was about to speak, Ethan cut her off, his tone ice cold. "Stay away from my wife. Otherwise, you'll regret ever being born." Then, he wrapped an arm around my waist and led me away. Melissa stood frozen in place, her face twisting with resentment as she watched us leave. A journalist managed to capture the moment on camera. The next day, a headline dominated the trending searches. "Vice President Foster protects his wife, rising starlet publicly humiliated." After that, Melissa disappeared from the spotlight for a while. Rumors swirled that several brands had cut ties with her. Even though James spoke up in her defense, no one cared. No one wanted to offend Ethan Foster. Just as she had started gaining fame, her agency shelved her. James, ever since discovering that I was Ethan's wife, had stopped bothering me. But when he heard that Melissa had once again crossed me, Even he had reached his limit. He publicly announced that he would no longer support her. That was the final blow. Melissa's entire career crumbled overnight. She couldn't accept it. In our past life, she had been untouchable. James had loved her unconditionally. She had everything she wanted. How could she possibly accept being reduced to nothing? And yet, she couldn't even get close to Ethan. She couldn't even rely on James anymore. But somehow, she found a way back into his life. That day, as I walked out of the mall, I unexpectedly ran into Melissa and James. Melissa's gaze locked onto me immediately. She clung to James's arm even tighter, as if trying to prove something. "Oh, what a coincidence, Mrs. Foster." James's expression flickered with embarrassment. Instinctively, he pulled his arm away from Melissa's grip and hurriedly explained to me, "There's nothing between us. I just felt sorry for her and wanted to help." This was exactly the same excuse he had used in our past life, time and time again, to justify his ambiguous relationship with Melissa. Melissa stiffened, clearly caught off guard by his sudden coldness. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but James didn't even notice her discomfort. He was too focused on explaining himself to me. Melissa tried to move closer to him again, but this time, James shoved her away. She stumbled back and fell hard onto the ground. How familiar. This exact scene had played out almost every single day before I died in my past life. Only this time, our roles had been reversed. What a joke. James was nothing but a selfish, greedy man who always wanted more. Even though Melissa was right in front of him, completely his for the taking, his heart still wavered toward me. That night, after returning home, I had another nightmare. But this one was different from the ones before. This time, there was an unfamiliar memory. In my past life, after I died, Melissa's heart transplant was successful. She and James had celebrated her second chance at life. But then, someone knocked them unconscious. When James woke up, he found himself dangling off a cliffside, tied up. As he screamed for help, Ethan appeared. His eyes were bloodshot with hatred. "You should both be dead," his voice was eerily calm. "How dare you kill her?" Only then did James notice Melissa's chest, where her heart had been transplanted, was now a gaping, bloody hole. The heart was gone. James's mind went blank. Ethan's voice rang out again, filled with venom. "She was never yours to take. You don't deserve to have anything that belonged to her." In that moment, Ethan looked like death itself. With a flick of his hand, the ropes binding James and Melissa loosened. James barely had time to beg for his life before a terrifying scream echoed, and both of them plunged into the abyss. The scene shifted. Ethan was now kneeling before my grave. His eyes were filled with grief. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice hoarse. "I was too late. I failed to protect you." Then I watched in horror as he plunged a knife into his own chest. He killed himself, right in front of my grave. I jolted awake, my body drenched in cold sweat. Behind me, Ethan instinctively pulled me into his arms. "Another nightmare?" he murmured sleepily. I clung tightly to him. "Don't be scared, Ethan. I'm here." His soothing warmth calmed me, and soon I drifted back into sleep. This time, my dreams were peaceful. No one knew the truth. I wasn't just some outsider who had married into the Foster family. I had been raised in their household. Ethan and I had grown up together, practically like siblings. At least, that was how I saw it. But later, I realized his feelings were never just brotherly. People used to tease him, calling me his childhood fiancé. And he took it seriously. From that moment on, he was convinced that I was meant to be his wife. But when I went to college, I fell for James, so Ethan let me go. To suppress his emotions, he left the country. Meanwhile, the James family was crumbling. Many of their business partners had cut ties, severing all cooperation. Desperate, James came to me. "Rachel, for the sake of what we once had, please help me," he pleaded. "Tell Ethan to stop." I looked at him blankly. I've never interfered in Ethan's business decisions. His voice turned desperate. "You don't have to be so cruel. You're not like this." I narrowed my eyes. He hesitated. Then he finally blurted out, "Melissa told me. You died once. She said you still love me, that you only hate me because I hurt you before." I let out a cold laugh. Hatred boiled inside me. "Oh, did she forget to tell you how I died?" I took a step closer, my voice steady but sharp. "It was because of you. Because of both of you." James's face drained of color. Before he could say another word, security arrived and threw him out. That scene had been witnessed by many people, and James lost all dignity. Shortly after, I heard news about both James and Melissa. Melissa had been sent to prison, and James, he was in the emergency room. He had been stabbed over a dozen times. Each wound carefully avoided his vital organs. Melissa had tortured him, leaving his body covered in wounds. It made sense, she had studied medicine. Afterwards, she turned herself in. Because of her good attitude during confession, and because the doctors classified James's injuries as minor, she was only sentenced to 1 year in prison. Apparently, Melissa had suffered a heart attack in prison. The pain had been unbearable. So just like in our past life, she sought James to find her a new heart. But James had refused, and even if he had wanted to, he was in no position to help her. The James family was on the brink of bankruptcy, having been deliberately targeted by Ethan. James was already overwhelmed trying to save his family. Melissa had chosen the worst possible time to make demands of him. Instead of sympathy, she received mockery. "Didn't you say you were untouchable in our past life?" James sneered. "Didn't you brag about how powerful you were? What happened? Why aren't you still shining now?" That was Melissa's breaking point. While James was off guard, she grabbed a fruit knife from the table and stabbed him. For 5 years, James had kept his distance from women, as if trying to prove something. Now countless reporters had gathered outside the hospital. "Mr. James, did you foresee the downfall of the James family? Rumors say Ethan Foster targeted you because you had intentions toward his wife. Is this true? Melissa was your girlfriend, wasn't she? Why did she stab you so many times?" James, pale and speechless, had no way to defend himself. And then, a bombshell piece of news broke. Melissa had died in prison, a heart attack. When reporters informed James, he froze. Then he laughed and cried at the same time. "Good," he muttered. "She's dead. That's good. That's good." I watched it all unfold on the news, my emotions complicated. Ethan walked over and wrapped an arm around me. Our daughter, always playful, ran up and hugged my leg. The three of us held each other close. Our future was just beginning. Years later, I was walking along the street when I noticed a homeless painter. Despite the scorching summer heat, he was wrapped in layers, covering himself completely. My daughter tugged at my sleeve and whispered, "Mommy, isn't he hot?" I smiled. Maybe he doesn't feel the heat. I didn't pay much attention, but as soon as I spoke, the painter's hand froze. He had been reaching for his paint, but now his entire body stiffened. Then, without a word, he quickly packed up his supplies and turned to leave. Just as he disappeared down the street, my daughter gasped in excitement. "Mommy, the person in his painting, it looked just like you." Startled, I turned around. But the painter was already gone.